Hello, this is Pamela Berkowitz discussing the Four Worlds Saga. The readers know exactly where and when the action takes place as author Tony Wolff and illustrator Yao Vieira take them back in time to a few months before the outbreak of World War I in 1914 London and the fight for a woman's right to vote in their graphic novel, The Four Worlds Saga, Suffragitsu, Mrs. Pankhurst Amazons. The work is a 64-page compilation of 3 issues originally released as The Votes for Women, January 2015, Shoulder to Shoulder, February 2015, and Failure is Impossible, March 2015. The Seattle firm Jet City Comics published all of the issues and the subsequent graphic novel trilogy. What I find intriguing in the aforementioned work is the convergence of the central character, Persephone, a fictional devotee of the historical suffragist leader, Emmeline Pankhurst, and the Victorian-era interest in staying fit via self-defense sports such as boxing and fencing, and with the emergence of female students pursuing the martial art of Bartitsu at Persephone's Uncle Edward's Bartitsu Club, which emulates the historical Edward Barton Wright's invention of Bartitsu and his school in London circa 1900. What the creators ignore is that Mr. Barton Wright's Bartitsu school closed in 1903, and their story takes place in 1914. They also kill off the head of the United Kingdom suffragist movement, Mrs. Pankhurst, prematurely in the first issue, when in the real world she lived until 1928, just shortly before women in the United Kingdom were given full voting rights. Of course, artistic license allows for an unhistorical elaboration to tell the story. In the first issue, Votes for Women, Act 1 begins on page 4, which illustrates the mini-comic flow ending with the reader pulled to the next page via a character looking to stage left, also known as the reader's right, and continues on to the end of Act 1 on page 9. And then Act 2 begins on page 10 and ends on page 21. Act 3 begins on page 22 and ends on page 24. Page counts for the acts are 7, 11, and 3, and are more akin to the act structure one would expect to see in a modern movie. In the second issue, Shoulder to Shoulder, Act 1 begins on page 27 and ends on page 34, and then Act 2 begins on page 35 and ends on page 45. Act 3 begins on page 46 and ends on page 48. Page counts for the acts 8, 11, and 3 are interesting in that there is more setup before the rescue action in Act 2, and then the quick denouement. In the third issue, Failure is Impossible, Act 1 begins on page 51, picking up at exactly where Act 2 left off, and then it ends on page 58. Then Act 2 begins on page 59 and ends on page 66. Act 3 begins on page 67 and ends on 72. I think the page counts for the acts 8, 8, and 6 differs from the first 2 issues due to the fact that the third issue jumps into the story immediately without reestablishing the setting or recapping the story, and the second act seamlessly continues on from the first. The author does not adhere strictly to the 1/4, 1/2, 1/4 pacing in the first 2 issues, where the first act is a little longer, but the second act comes in at 50%, and the third act is exactly or close to half the length of the first act. The third issue seamlessly transitions into and out of the second act, which made it difficult to suss out the second act breaks, and it began with an unusually long and action-packed first act. There is a solid story arc with a beginning, middle, and an end to pull the reader through the story in the first 2 issues. The resolution is satisfactory for the first 2, and the third issue resolves most of the storylines, but the end poses new questions that one might expect to be answered in a next issue that has not been produced. The central character Persephone begins the series devoted to the suffragist cause, and as the result of being drugged by the lead villain, we learn that her motivation comes from the deep-seated trauma of having her child stolen from her immediately after it was born. She finally tells a close friend about what happened, and revealing the trauma takes the edge off the pain that she will always carry with her. The directional flow and transitions work well between the panels. The majority of the pages are clearly mini-comics with an introductory setting, action driven by conflict, and a mini-resolution that works effectively. However, the transitions from page to page frequently have the characters looking to their stage right, reader left, or straight ahead at the reader, instead of stage left, reader right, to lead you to the next page. In the first 2 issues, the author uses the artifice of personal diary entries by Persephone to handle any necessary exposition and to share the thoughts and emotions of the heroine. Thank you for providing an interesting challenge. This is Pamela Berkowitz signing off.